Well, as you can see, we're sitting in a construction site. This is actually our video studio that we're building. And so the good news is that there's progress. Things are happening, and at some point in the future, well, this room will be finished off. It's going to be a mostly soundproof room with 2 walls and 2 lots of insulation. Anyway, we thought for the fun of it, we'd film in here today to give you a sense of what's coming. Anyway, we're now in Acts chapter 14, and we're going to read, but Paul basically gets stoned to death in this chapter. They heal someone. People think that they are the Roman gods come down. Paul's trying to tell them they're not. It all somehow flips around and they end up nearly he gets basically stoned to death. It's all very interesting, but let's read Acts chapter 14 first. In Iconium, they entered together into the synagogue of the Jews, and so spoke that a great multitude of both Jews and Greeks believed. But the disbelieving Jews stirred up and embittered the souls of the Gentiles against the brothers. Therefore, they stayed there a long time, speaking boldly in the Lord, who testified to the word of his grace, granting signs and wonders to be done by their hands. But the multitude of the city was divided. Paul part sided with the Jews and part with the apostles. When some of both the Gentiles and the Jews, with their rulers, made a violent attempt to mistreat and stone them, they became aware of it and fled to the cities of Lycaonia, Lystra, Derbe, and the surrounding region, and there they preached the good news. At Lystra, a certain man sat, impotent in his feet, a cripple from his mother's womb who had never walked. He was listening to Paul speaking, who, fastening eyes on him and seeing that he had faith to be made whole, said with a loud voice, "Stand upright on your feet." He leaped up and walked. When the multitude saw what Paul had done, they lifted up their voice, saying in the language of Lycaonia, "The gods have come down to us in the likeness of men." They called Barnabas Jupiter and Paul Mercury, because he was the chief speaker. The priest of Jupiter, whose temple was in front of the city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates and would have made a sacrifice along with the multitudes. But when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of it, they tore their clothes and sprang into the multitude, crying out, "Men, why are you doing these things? We are men with like passions with you, and we bring you good news that you should turn from these things to the living God, who made the sky, the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, who in generations gone by allowed all the nations to walk in their own ways, and yet he didn't leave himself without witness, in that he did good and gave you rain from the sky and fruitful seasons, filling our hearts with food and gladness." But even saying these things, they hardly stopped the multitudes from making a sacrifice to them. But some Jews came from Antioch and Iconium, and having persuaded the multitudes, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing that he was dead. But as the disciples stood around him, he rose up and entered into the city. On the next day he went out with Barnabas to Derbe. When they had preached the good news to that city and had made many disciples, they returned to Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch, strengthening the souls of the disciples, exhorting them to continue in the faith, and that through many afflictions we must enter into God's kingdom. When they had appointed elders for them in every assembly and had prayed with fasting, they commended them to the Lord on whom they had believed. They passed through Pisidia, came to Pamphylia. When they had spoken the word in Perga, they went down to Italia, and from there they sailed to Antioch, from where they had been committed to the grace of the Lord for the work which they had fulfilled. When they arrived and had gathered the assembly together, they reported all the things that God had done with them, and that he had opened a door of faith to the nations. They stayed there with the disciples a long time. And there ends the first missionary journey. Super cool. You might have one of those Bibles with maps in the back of Paul's missionary journeys. Well, that's the end of the first missionary journey which he undertakes with Paul. And they start out by going to Crete, they go up north into the southern part of Asia Minor, and they circle around and come back to Antioch. So they do a circle. And in this chapter, they start out in Iconium, they preach, they have some success, but like in so many places, there's disbelieving Jews and believing Jews, and the disbelieving Jews cause problems and they have to escape the town, which happens a lot to Paul. And then they get to a town called Lystra. Now, Lystra and Derbe are these two towns in a part of the world back then called Lyconium. Some people think, Bert Kaufman, who I really quite like as a commentator, he's one of these people. He thinks that these towns are in Galatia. And, like in the Bible, we've got the letter to the Galatians. Well, Bert Kaufman is convinced that these cities are in Galatia. So he thinks that Paul and Barnabas come to Lystra and Derbe and preach in these cities of Lycaonia, but he's convinced that the letter to the Galatians later is written to these people. But I don't think that's the case, because later on in chapter 16 of Luke, it says that they headed north to Galatia. So even in the book of Acts, it says that these cities are in Lycaonia, but Galatia is a different region. So I think Bert Kaufman and some other people are wrong about this. He's not in the Galatian region yet. He's in the Lycaonian region. And in this city of Lystra, in verse 8, it says there was a man who was lame from birth. Paul was speaking, this is verse 9, it says that this lame man was listening to Paul who was speaking and fastening eyes on him. When you're preaching, which I've done plenty of, you notice sometimes that there's someone in the congregation who's really fixed their eyes on you, but it's like they're completely connected to what's being said. Like, you'll notice it as a preacher, you notice it from time to time. It's almost as though you're saying something that's so interesting to the person, you've got their full attention. So this lame guy here in Lystra, Paul has got his full attention. He's fixed on Paul. And it says here that Paul could see he had faith. This man clearly believed what Paul was saying, and Paul knew that in this moment healing would be available for him. He says to him, stand up and walk, and the man is healed. So this is a man that's never walked in his life, lame from birth. So that's quite a thing. So, everyone knows this guy, because when you're in places like this, I've been to India, and there are towns or there are places that remind me of Bible places. And I remember in a place in India called Bhimavaram, there was a man there who had elephantiasis or elephantitis. He had one leg that was swollen up so big he could not walk, and he sat on a skateboard and rolled around town. And in some parts of the West, you don't see beggars. Certainly in Australia, you don't tend to see them. There are certainly some homeless people here, but they tend to be not visible. If in some parts of the West, like Los Angeles, you can see the homeless, or Vancouver City, you can see the homeless. And sometimes in America, people will come up to you at a fuel station and say, could I please have money for fuel? Or so people will beg in a kind of a Western way. But in some places in the world, it's people and their needs are much more obvious. Like that man in Bhimavaram, I've never forgotten him, the man with elephantiasis. So in a town like Lystra, there's a lame man. They stand out, like everyone knows who they are. So then you have a man like that who suddenly is walking. It's not just kind of like, you're not having to convince people this is a miracle. They all know it's a miracle. They all know this guy has never walked. And the result of this miracle is they think that Paul and Barnabas are like the gods come down in human form. People don't think that today because the world, at least the Western world we're living in, has been Christianized. So if you talk to someone in the street, it's not a question of whether there are gods. They either believe that there's a God, like one, or they don't believe there's a God. But there are some parts of the world that are still polytheistic. The less Western parts of the world, like in Indian cultures, Well, they still believe in the gods. Well, Roman culture was polytheistic. They believed in the gods. And in this chapter, it says that they thought that Paul was Jupiter and that Barnabas was Mercury. Now, these are the names of planets that we've got. All our planets are named after Roman gods. But actually, in the Bible, in the Greek language, it doesn't say Jupiter and Mercury. It says Zeus and Hermes or Hermes. These were the Greek gods. So what happened was that when the Roman Empire came along and conquered all the Greek lands, they just accepted the Greek system of gods and just put their own names on it. So this web translation has put the Roman names for the gods in, but actually, if you read a different version, maybe the NIV, it'll just have the Greek names because that's what's written in the Greek. And if you know anything about Greek culture, like you've read, say, for example, Homer's Iliad or Homer's Odyssey, they have this interaction between the gods and people is really common. Or a story like Jason and the Argonauts, there might be people, Greek people fighting on the battlefield, but the story will tell also of what the gods are doing at the same time, and the gods will have their favourite soldiers, like Achilles or something, and they'll be helping them out. And sometimes the gods in the Greek legends would become people and kind of interact. So this is not like a strange idea to them. It's in all their like classical literature. So when Paul and Barnabas, when this miracle occurs, it's just kind of like a reasonable idea to them that, only gods could do a miracle like that. And gods do become people at times and mix with us. Here they are. But it's strange to us in Western culture to think that, but it's not strange for them to think that. And the world's been so changed by the gospel and the teaching of Scripture that these ideas are now strange to us. But the idea of gods becoming people is not actually, it's not an odd idea at all. And in fact, Jesus himself becomes God incarnate. He becomes a man Jesus is God who's become a person. And so even that idea wasn't strange to Greek and Roman people. And you know that when Jesus is like on trial with Pontius Pilate, and he says to Pilate, "My kingdom is not of this world, I'm a king, but I'm not from here," kind of thing. Pilate takes that all very seriously. He doesn't think you're an idiot, because Pilate has kind of this background way of thinking about it. I want to say something about this, though. The Greek and the Roman gods were very much, what the term for it is anthropomorphized. Anthro, like from humanity or from mankind. It's like the gods that they believed in, which are not real gods, but they kind of act like people. If you read ancient Greek literature, the gods will get married, they'll have children, they'll get jealous, they'll have affairs, they will be angry with each other, they'll curse each other. They act like people. And the reason they act like people is because they're made up by people. People have imagined gods and made them up. But it's really common for, when you're listening to a video made by an atheist or something, for them to say that the Christian God's made up God too, but is not. The Christian God is not anthropomorphized. The Christian God is a God that's hard to understand. And there are aspects to God, like, for example, he's Trinitarian. He's three people, but in one God. That doesn't make sense at all. If you were going to make up a God, you would never make up things that didn't make sense. But God is like that because he's not made up. And secular people say, who don't want to believe in God, they say, the Trinity, that's just made up nonsense. But no, it's not made up nonsense because no one would ever have thought of it. All the other gods that are made up are like people. They've got people-like qualities. But the one and true God, the one that's not been invented because he's actually God, has qualities we don't understand. We try to explain how can he be fully loving, fully just. We try to explain God's qualities, and theologians have been wrestling with them for thousands of years because God's complicated. He's not something that's been made up. You don't have to argue about the qualities of the Greek gods because they're just like people. but the God we love and worship is complicated. And it's that God that became a man in the form of Jesus Christ. So here in this chapter 14, they think Paul and Barnabas are like the Greek gods. And so that's why, and at first Paul and Barnabas don't realize, because it says they were speaking in the language of Lycaonia. Paul and Barnabas only knew Greek. But after a while they realize what's going on, they try to stop it. And then it says that some Jews came from Iconium. So these are some of the disbelieving Jews from the previous town where they'd been at. And they turn the crowd and they start to stone them. And then it says they left Paul for dead. Now, there's a couple of things I want to quickly say. Where is my note on this? Okay, it's in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 2 to 4. In 2 Corinthians, Paul describes an experience where he was caught up to heaven. And there's quite a few Bible commentators that think the moment where Paul was caught up to heaven was this moment in Acts chapter 14 where Paul is left for dead. People generally know when someone's dead. It's very rare for people to think that someone's dead and for them not to be dead and for them to come back. So they stone Paul, which is, it's not throwing pebbles. These are big rocks being slammed down on his head, and it's not fun. And then they leave him believing that he is dead. So he's injured, he's in pain, he appears to be dead. They drag him out of the city, they leave him there. And that's where, if there's a moment you're going to pick in the Bible to say, when would Paul have possibly gone to have an experience of heaven? This is like the most likely moment that we know of, or otherwise it happened at some other time that's just not recorded. And Paul describes being caught up to heaven and hearing things in God's throne that he wasn't even able to repeat. And we all wonder what they were. But it's almost certainly, or quite likely, could have been this moment. And some people think that he was actually dead and the Lord brought him back to life, or he either died and the Lord brought him back, or whether they just thought he was dead. And so, imagine going through that experience. And then Paul comes back, he stands up on his feet, he walks back into town, and then he's encouraged by the local believers and he leaves. And then after he leaves to move on to the next town, Derbe, he recovers his strength and they go back through the last few towns, and then they head back home to Antioch, which is where they started the missionary journey from. Along the way, they go through these two towns, Lystra and Derbe, and there's someone who we're pretty sure gets saved when Paul is there, and that would be Timothy. Timothy, who later in the Bible, there are two letters written, 1st and 2nd Timothy, and Timothy ends up traveling with Paul later in the second missionary journey, but Timothy is from Lystra and Derbe, and it would seem that it's in this chapter that that's when he comes to know the Lord, comes to faith. So super, super cool to know that happens. Imagine it was you. Imagine you did that journey and you spent that couple of years or 18 months, whatever it was, traveling, facing persecution in town after town after town, fleeing towns multiple times, being stoned to death. Would you do it again? Well, Paul does, multiple times and more. And I thank the Lord for people like Paul who are so determined they're going to preach. And, the Lord called the right person. And the Lord may not have called you and I to be Paul, but he's called us to be something. And whatever the Lord's called you to do, you need to do it with all your heart. Father, thank you for Acts 14 and the determination of Paul to preach despite being stoned and persecuted. And Father, I thank you for the words that have come down to us because of Paul. And I pray that we would be strengthened in the calling that we have been given. In Jesus' name, amen.